It's after 7, so I'm going to begin. Yep. So, good evening, everybody, and my name is Salecker. First off, I want to thank you all for coming out. What I'm going to talk to you about is about the disaster to the steamboat Sultana. And it's the largest or the greatest maritime disaster in American history. More people died on the Sultana than perished on the Titanic, yet few people ever heard of it. And myself and a group of dedicated people who either had relatives on board or, like myself, didn't have anybody on board but just fell in love with the story, are trying to go around the country and change this. Let people know that's about the Sultana. And when you talk about disasters, don't always think of the Titanic. Think of the Sultana, which happened right here on American waters. And I guess to start the presentation, I should tell you, this is a photograph of the Sultana. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of the Sultana or before. There was only one known photograph of the Sultana up until probably about 2 years ago. And it was the one, and I'll show you a little bit later, where it's loaded with the soldiers, the prisoners, released prisoners, as they're being brought home. This was a photograph that was found only a couple years ago in St. Louis, Missouri. There were, before our Sultana came out, there was 3 other boats named the Sultana, and each one had met with a demise. None of them as bad as our Sultana. So the curators of the museum that had this thought this was one of the earlier boats, but we were able to identify it as our Sultana for a couple of different reasons. If you look on the little handout sheet that I gave you, you can see some of the different configuration in the boat. The Sultana was built in January of 1863 in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it was first used on the Ohio River for about 6 months. It ran up and down the Ohio River. One of the problems, it was supposed to go from Cincinnati all the way up to Pittsburgh, but when it got to Wheeling, West Virginia, it was found out that the smokestacks here were too tall and it couldn't get under the bridge at Wheeling, the railroad bridge at Wheeling, West Virginia. So it had to offload all the supplies there, and then it would take on whatever supplies it could and go back down to Cincinnati. The Sultana had been built, even though the war was on, it had been built with the cotton trade in mind. They knew that eventually the war was going to be over and there'd be all this cotton down in the south that would have to be brought up north. So they built the Sultana with extra wide decking on the second deck, which is sometimes called, its actual name is the boiler deck, although the boilers are down here on the main deck. But this is sometimes also called the second deck or the cabin deck, because that's the cabin where the paying passengers would also stay. But this was built with a very, very wide decking here. Also, the chimneys were so high so that sparks wouldn't come out and land on top of the cotton. Also, it had a very wide space in the front here on the hurricane deck, and also in the front on that second deck. Again, that was so it could load more cotton on board and carry that. But as you'll see later on, the government looked at this and said, boy, those are great decks to put troops on. So it was used as a troop transport prior to the trip that I'll tell you about. The Sultana ran up and down the Ohio River for about 6 months. It finally dropped down to the Mississippi River, and its home port was St. Louis. It would run the St. Louis to New Orleans trip. Well, once the river opened up in 1863, when Vicksburg fell and the river finally opened up, it was able to, in July of '63, it was finally able to go all the way down to New Orleans, and it ran that trip usually about once every 3 months, going all the way down, coming all the way back up. The Sultana, Sultana was at Cairo, Illinois, on April 14th. When it got word that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Actually, it was the morning of the 15th. It was on a downriver trip going down to New Orleans. It had left St. Louis. It was docked at the city when the city got by telegraph that Lincoln had been assassinated. The captain of the boat, Captain J. Cass Mason, who was very young, very almost impetuous. He was known on the river as running a real fast boat. Nowadays, he'd be one of these kids racing up and down the street with his hot rod. That was the type of guy that J. Cass Mason was. He saw this information about the Lincoln assassination. His boat was ready to go. He grabbed a bunch of Cairo newspapers and decided if he could be the first boat to spread the news of the disaster down to the south, because all the telegraph lines had been torn down, he would make a name for the Sultana as the boat that took and spread the messenger of death and spread the word of Lincoln's assassination. Gathered a bunch of these papers on board, and started going downriver. At the same time, excuse me, at the same time that the Sultana was going downriver, a group of prisoners were waiting at Vicksburg. They had been released from Andersonville prison. This is a picture of Andersonville prison here. Let me see if I can focus that up a little. There you go. These prisoners had been released from Andersonville prison and also from Cahaba, Alabama, which is close. It's about 30 miles south of Selma, Alabama. Those are two prison camps. The Confederacy was basically falling apart. They had all these men. They didn't know what to do with them. They said, well, we'll ship them over to Vicksburg. They can sit in an exchange camp there and wait for exchange. Now, what they meant by exchange is the North had a lot of Southern prisoners. The South had a lot of Northern prisoners. What they were supposed to do is get the two sides together and transfer one for one, 10 here, 100 and 100. So they brought them over to Vicksburg. They sat in this camp waiting for this exchange. Typical of the men that were released from Andersonville is this fellow here. This is Epinetus McIntosh from the 14th Illinois Infantry. He was one of only two men from Illinois that eventually ended up on the Sultana, and he would live through the disaster. He had been captured in October of 1864, and when he was released in April of 1865, only 7 months later, he looked like this. He had been captured weighing 175 pounds. At the time of his release, he was 85 pounds. He said, however, that he thought by losing that weight that's what actually helped him survive the Sultana, because he said had he been as heavy as he was, the little pieces of scrap wood that he was able to grab and hang on to would not have been able to support his weight of 175 pounds. So he said by losing all that weight, it actually saved his life. When the Sultana came downriver and docked at Vicksburg, one of the first, and this was on April 17th, one of the first things that happened was the captain, J. Cash Mason, knew that these men were waiting there, and he wanted to take and get a load of these men to take back north. The reason was he was going to get $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer by a government contract to take them back up north to St. Louis or Cairo, Illinois, wherever they had to go. He got off the boat here at Vicksburg. He went and saw, if you look on that sheet of paper there, the fella in the, which would be, I guess, the way you're looking at it, would be the lower left-hand corner, Colonel Hatch. He was the chief quartermaster in charge at Vicksburg, and Mason, for some reason, Hatch actually went and saw Mason. Mason was under the impression that Hatch had control of all these prisoners and that he could get a load of men for him. Hatch was a very, very unscrupulous person. Unfortunately, he came from Illinois, and I hate to admit that, but he was. He had been caught a few times throughout the war doing very unscrupulous things. He had been down in Cairo, Illinois at one point in charge of the quartermaster stores, and what he was doing, he was selling the government saddles and the bridles and blankets. Everything that the government owned, he was selling it to private citizens and cashing the money. At one point, he was buying lumber from Chicago at $2 a foot, selling it to the government for $5 a foot, and pocketing the $3 himself. Eventually, this was pointed out to the generals in charge, and he threw his books into the river so he couldn't get caught. Unfortunately, the books washed up. They grabbed them. They had brought him before a court-martial, but what happened was his brother was Ozias M. Hatch, who was the Secretary of State of Illinois and a very good personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. He made some, connections and such like that, and Hatch got off. So he was never found guilty for any of the misdoings that he had. Eventually, he wound up as a quartermaster in charge of Vicksburg, where he was still pretty shady, and he gave Mason, the captain of the Sultana, the impression that when Mason came back upriver, he would get as many men as he wanted. Mason then continued downriver with the Sultana, and in the meantime, on April 22nd, this steamboat in the middle here, the Henry Ames, came back upriver, docked at Vicksburg, and took on the first load of prisoners being sent up north. What happened was they were supposed to be exchanged one for one. The Confederacy figured, well, we're falling apart, we're not going to be around anymore, just take the men. We'll worry about exchanging them later on. So they put them on a parole, as they're called parole. They're not really exchanged. They said, just take them. The Henry Ames took 1,400 people, 1,400 people crowded onto this boat and started up north. By the way, I probably should have pointed out, these boats were usually registered with the government to carry around 400 people. The Sultana was registered to carry 376 passengers and crew. Remember that as I get further on. A second boat came up shortly after the Henry Ames, and this was the Olive Branch, and it arrived on April 23rd, just one day after the Henry Ames. There weren't enough men counted. There was a lot of men still at this camp waiting to be sent north, prisoners waiting to be sent north, but they weren't counted and their names weren't down yet. So they only put 700 men on this boat and sent it up north. Again, this probably should have only carried about 400 people. On the 21st of April, the Sultana was down in New Orleans. It took on board 75 passengers and had a crew of 85 men, so about 155 people there. So that's well below the 376. It started up going upriver towards Vicksburg. Now it's coming upriver on its return trip. About 7 hours south of Vicksburg, the boiler, one of these boilers here, suddenly started dripping water. It had a leak. The engineer took and he slowed the boat down and nursed it into Vicksburg. When he got there, he took and he found the boiler mechanic, brought him back to the boat. He looked at it. The boiler mechanic looked at the boilers, found out that the plate has bulged and ruptured and had created a little gap and water was dripping down. He said in order for him to repair it, he'd have to cut these sheets out and rivet in a new plate. The engineer knew that they were scheduled to get these prisoners, and he knew that this repair would take 2 or 3 days, so he decided, well, we don't have that time. Is there anything you can do to it? The mechanic at first refused, and then they finally talked him into it, to pounding back the metal and riveting a piece of metal over the top of it to try for a temporary repair. They said when they get up to St. Louis, they'll get it fixed. Don't worry about that. So he agreed to that. In the meantime, Mason went into town looking for his promised load of prisoners. He met with Hatch in the corner down here. Hatch said, we've only got about 400 men on the rolls ready to go. Mason was fit to be tied. Actually, in the far right-hand corner down here, as you're looking at it, Captain Speed, he had volunteered to be in charge of the prisoners, and he was the guy writing out the rolls. He said, we only got 400 ready, that's all I can give you. Mason said no. He said it wouldn't be worth my time to stay here for almost a day waiting for these men to be put on board. He says, I demand more of them. He says, I've got a government contract, I demand more of them. He went back to see Hatch. In the meantime, this fellow in the middle here, Williams, had been out trying to get permission for these soldiers to be released. He came back, try to stay with me on this. He came back, and Hatch and Williams talked together and said, why can't we just put the prisoners on board without counting them, without having their names? We've got the Confederate rolls. We'll just have to transfer names for the Confederate rolls as mixed up as they are and put them in the right order, and we can do this afterwards. Put all the men on the boat and send the boat north. So they talked to Speed. Speed said, okay. They said, how many people do you think you got out at camp? He said, about 1,400. They said, okay, we'll start doing this the next day. In the meantime, so the boilers were being repaired, and none of these officers knew that these boilers were being repaired now. So now they had assigned the Sultana 1,400 people with these bad boilers, and they had had trouble with these boilers before. In the meantime, the Lady Gay, a much larger steamboat, showed up, and they also showed interest in these prisoners. They knew these prisoners were there, and they said, can we take some? They talked to the different officers. The officers said, no, there's only 1,400 left. They're all going to go on the Sultana. So Lady Gay, a much larger steamboat than the Sultana, left without any prisoners on board. The men started arriving at the Sultana on the morning of April 24th. What happened is Speed went out to the camp. He was putting the men on the train and sending them into town. Standing at the boat was Williams. He stood by the gangplank and counted them as they went on board. Unfortunately, he got wind of a bribe. What had happened was Mason had promised Hatch, if you give me as many men as you can, I will take and give you a little cut of the pay. So that's why Hatch was trying to get all these people put on board the Sultana. Williams got wind of it, but he didn't think it was Hatch that was taking a bribe. He thought it was Speed out at the camp. So he went to complain. He left the Sultana and went to complain. In the meantime, Speed out at the camp went to lunch. They both missed a second trainload of prisoners loaded with 400 to 500 people that came into town, got off, and walked on board the Sultana. So Speed didn't know they had left. Williams didn't know they had arrived. So both of them were short 500 people in their total count. So they didn't know how many people would eventually end up on board the Sultana. Eventually, this is the Vicksburg waterfront. The waterfront became crowded with men. As the men showed up, they could see that the boat was getting overcrowded. It was getting so badly overcrowded, the decks were starting to sag and creak, and the crewmen had to put bracings underneath the deck to keep the decks from caving in. The men started complaining. They said, we're not going to go any further. Another steamboat showed up, the Pauline Carroll. They said, why can't we go on that boat? As I said, now the officers had made the decision, Hatch and such, to put everybody on board the Sultana. Hatch was doing it for monetary reasons. Williams had come back to the boat, and he was bound and determined, sure that there was a bribe going on to keep people from getting on the Sultana, and he said, no, they're all going on the Sultana. Nobody's going on the Pauline Carroll. When the men protested, they said, the Pauline Carroll's full of smallpox. You don't want to go on that one. The men said, oh, sure. So they started climbing on board the Sultana, as crowded as they were. They figured, as crowded as they had been in prison camp, they could last 2 or 3 more days on the Sultana and not worry. They were going home. They said, okay, we'll put up with it this once. Major Fiddler of the 6th Kentucky Cavalry, he was in charge of these prisoners. When he arrived at the boat with a 3rd trainload of men, the 3rd and last trainload, he looked at it and he said, this is unbelievable. I don't want my men, getting as crowded as this. He put in a formal protest. Mason said, I got nothing to do with it. It's being loaded by the government. It's out of my hands. He did have something to do with it. He could have protested up the line to the different generals, to General Dana or to General Smith, but he didn't. He wanted the money, is what it was. He was going broke. Mason was going broke. He needed the cash, so he wasn't going to stop it in the least bit. When Fiddler took and protested to the officers said, basically, be quiet. We're handling this, and it's being loaded the way it is. Eventually, Fiddler would die on board the Sultana. He tried to survive, tried to save a drowning woman, and was never. They saw him jump in to save her, and was never seen again. In addition to the men being put on board the Sultana and the boilers being repaired, there was also 300,000 pounds of sugar that was being put into the Sultana in the hold, which would act as a ballast for it, but you have that in addition to this extra weight from these guys. There was also 100 government horses and mules being put on board. So finally, at 9 o'clock in the evening, on April 24th, 1865, the Sultana finally pulled away from Vicksburg. On board were 100 paying passengers that had booked passage without knowing all these men were going to be on board. And when they got there, they arrived, they said, well, it's too late to get a new steamboat now, we'll get on board. 100 civilian passengers, 85 crewmen, 22 guards from the 58th Ohio that would put on there to sort of keep the men under control, and 2,300 released Union prisoners, plus the cargo. This is on a boat that's legally registered to carry 376 people. So you have almost 2,500 people on a boat that was only supposed to carry 376. Oh, and there's one other thing. One other thing that they had on board was a pet alligator. The crew had a mascot pet alligator on board. And as the men climbed on board, they saw this alligator. It was in a wooden crate, and they were amazed by it. So they started poking sticks at it to watch it snap and hiss, and it was spinning around and flapping its tail. And after a while, the crewman said, no, this is cruel. So they took this big, sturdy wooden crate, and they dragged them underneath a stairwell, a closet, and they closed it off, and that's where the alligators stayed for the remainder of the trip. And we'll get back to that alligator in a bit. Now, as the Sultana was started upriver, the Mississippi River was at flood stage, similar to the way it was a few months ago or last month down at Cincinnati. The levees and the banks of the river had become so deteriorated with the war, nobody had taken it and repaired it, that the river at some places overflowed the banks, and it was 3 miles wide. Also, it was so deep that at points people thought that there were bushes sticking out of the water, and what that was the tops of trees. The whole rest of the tree was underwater. That's how deep the water was. As the Sultana was going upriver, it would pass other steamboats, and these men would all go to one side. As the boat went by, they tilted the boat. All these men on the one side, they were tilting the boat. Captain Mason and his crew were yelling at the men. The officers were telling them to stay in place because that created a danger to the boat. Not only might it tip over, but also you had 4 boilers on the Sultana, and there's water in all 4, and the water is connected. If the boat tilts, all the water from this upper boiler will now run down into the lower boilers. This upper boiler here is still being heated by the flames, so the metal's going to turn red hot. when the boat eventually tips back, now this water rushes into this hot metal, and it creates a much more steam than is supposed to be in there, and that can create more pressure and possibly explode your boilers. So the captain and his men were saying, his crew were saying, don't do that. Stay pretty calm as you go upriver. On April 26th, the Sultana docked at Helena, Arkansas. A photographer saw this as a very amazing sight and took this photograph. And as I said, this used to be the only known photograph of the Sultana. And you can see the decks are just literally covered with human beings. If this was a little bit clearer photograph, you would see there's a horse's head sticking over the rail here. The men are also hanging some of their laundry on the line here. And these holes that are cut into the paddle wheels and this stuff here is from the men going to the bathroom. They had no washroom facilities on these upper decks. The only washroom on a steamboat is behind the paddle wheel. Men on one side, women on the other side. When you're on the deck up here and you can't get into a line to get into the bathroom, they were breaking holes in here and going down into the paddle wheels to relieve themselves. So there's a lot to actually be seen in this. And on top of here is elk's horns. And that's to show that the Sultana was a very fast boat. It had set a record coming upriver, and they give these elk horns to it, so anybody wanting freight sent or as a passenger thinking they want a real fast boat would see that and know, hey, the Sultana's fast, let's book passage on this. So this is actually a pretty good, clear photograph. This is hard to see here. On April 26th at 7 o'clock, excuse me, in the evening, the Sultana pulled into Memphis. This is actually a photo of Memphis. I don't know if you can see this with a steamboat here and the waterfront and the town going up here. At Memphis, it unloaded, the Sultana crew unloaded those 300,000 pounds of sugar. Now, so they took that out of the hold. What this did was now this made the boat really top heavy. You had all these men and stuff on top, and you had no weight in the hold to keep it from flipping. The captain should have known this. His chief mate should have known this. The engineer should have known this. They probably did, but they did nothing to alleviate this difference. While it was in Memphis, a lot of the men took and went into the city. They weren't supposed to, but a lot of the men jumped ship and went into the city. And what they did was they went to a place called the Whiskey Chute, which was 2 miles long of nothing but saloons. And for a lot of the men, this is the first time they had whiskey in 2-3 years. And some of them got rip-roaring drunk. When the Sultana was ready to leave around midnight, it rang its bell. A lot of the men came back. Some of the men didn't. As it turned out, they were the lucky ones that missed the Sultana. One fellow was so drunk, they say he was a 7-footer. He's probably more like 6 feet. But a very tall person from Tennessee came back rip-roaring drunk, and the guards had went in town and got him at the point of a bayonet and brought him back on board. And I'll talk about him in a little bit too. Now, after leaving Memphis, the Sultana went across the river to Hopefield, Arkansas, where there were some coal barges, and it took on coal. While it was docked at Hopefield, one fella, George Downing of the 9th Indiana Cavalry, he found that he'd come running through the streets of Memphis and saw the steamboat on the other side and said, there goes my ride. He had sent home for some money, so he paid a guy $2 to row him across the river so he could get back on board the Sultana. As he was climbing on board, he told his friends, he said, quote, if I had not sent home for that money, I would have been left. 2 hours later, he was dead. He died in the explosion of the Sultana. So, that's where it didn't pay to get back on board. After leaving Hopefield, Arkansas down here, the Sultana continued upriver. It left about 1 o'clock. Continued upriver, and this dotted line is the channel that the steamboats are supposed to follow. The Sultana continued upriver. Now this would have all been flooded out. As it got up here, it was doing this crossing of the river, and as it did, it was getting hit by the water in the side, which they think probably careened the boat a little bit, which tilted that water into boilers, and may have led, plus the bad boilers to begin with, may have led to the explosion of the Sultana. One boiler exploded. Seconds later, 2 other boilers exploded. So a total of 3 boilers exploded. One man was quoted, this is at 2 o'clock in the morning, one man was quoted as saying, it sounded like the discharge of a pack of artillery and had the shock of a railroad collision. In a matter of seconds, the Sultana was mortally wounded. Now, the reason that I say the Sultana was mortally wounded, if you look at that other drawing that I showed you there, what happened was, anytime during a steamboat accident, what the pilot, the man, steering the boat, what he tried to do is run the boat into shore, and all the men and women would just jump onto the shore, and they could let it burn, or they could let it fall apart, or whatever. But the explosion of the boilers tore out the center of the boat, and that tore out the pilot house where this guy was. He actually got blown up into the air. So there was nobody there to steer it. It now became a floating hulk. And because the Sultana had been crossing from one side of the river to the other, and it actually had blown up almost directly in the middle of the river, there was now 1.5 miles of water on one side and 1.5 miles of water on the other side. Also, you'll see excuse me, the chimneys on here. One of them, as they were standing, there's a bracing in between. Without the boilers on between them, they lost their supports underneath, and they started to twist and turn. One fell backwards into the gaping hole here. The other one fell forwards into the very, very crowded deck where all these men were laying. Crushed that deck down on top of the other deck and actually squished people down between the two decks there. This fella here, William P. Madden with the 8th Ohio Cavalry, he was sleeping on the forward part of that deck where the smokestacks fell. And he awoke, he heard this terrible explosion, and he awoke and reached his hands up and burnt his hands. What had happened is a part of the boilers had blown up and had landed over the top of them. So he had this round piece of boiler over the top of him, and it was still searing hot. He could feel this heat. He was almost getting like a sunburn from inside here. And he started screaming and yelling, and eventually somebody cleared away some debris and reached in and pulled him out. And he had burnt his shoulder and his arm and his hands to a crisp. And he said he was lucky enough to, then get into the cooling water and help himself. Another fella, this is Otto Barden, said that he was in the stern area, the back end of the boat, when the boiler exploded and it blew. Steamboats were made of a very, very flimsy material because they wanted to be very light, so they could go up and down the river very fast. All this material, all these deckings just blew up on top of him, and he said that he said first he heard a terrible explosion, then hot steam, smoke, pieces of brickbat, and chunks of coal came thick and fast. Another person sleeping also in that stern area was Commodore Smith. He's not a Commodore, that was his name. Commodore Smith of the 18th Michigan Infantry. He said he saw people being thrown around like rag dolls. And he was near the stern, again, in that back area, and he said he was nearly buried with dead and wounded comrades, legs, arms, heads, and all parts of human bodies. So everybody that had been sleeping around the boilers, and as you can see from that one photograph, there was thousands of people on this boat, were just thrown all over and torn apart. The area immediately around the boilers suddenly started to burn. And as I said, it was made of very, very flimsy wood. There was fire buckets on the Sultana, but the problem was a lot of these men needed water as they were going upriver, and they had emptied the sand out of the fire buckets and used the buckets to dip them into the river and get water. So they had added to their own demise by using this. Now that when the crew went to look for the fire buckets, they were no longer there. Nobody knew where they were passed around. The men started to panic. This exploded at 2 o'clock in the morning. They had been sleeping. They didn't know what had happened. They started to panic and started pushing one another. This little fire from the boilers being exploded, from the furnaces and stuff being exploded, started burning. Next thing you know, the flames just got totally out of control. Had they kept their mind, they could have probably put it out, but it's understandable, that they did panic. This fella here, Chester Berry, was with the 20th Michigan Infantry, and he was out on the very front of the boat, on the bow, on the first deck, or the main deck. And he said he saw the flames swept fiercely up and back through the light wood of the upper decks. As this fire broke out behind these men here, all these people on the bow suddenly started pushing and shoving each other to get into the river. People that couldn't swim were just pushed over. Those that could swim jumped into the water. Excuse me, this was April. The water was freezing cold. They started out swimming. They found out that from being in the prison, they were so weak and tired that they couldn't keep up after a while. They were trying to grab things. People were grabbing onto them. People were just going down by the dozens, by the hundreds. One fella I don't have a photograph of. Simeon Shelf was his name, of the 6th Kentucky Cavalry, said that these men panicked and were pushing so hard that he saw one man that had been killed by the explosion that had fallen onto the deck. People were stepping over his dead body, and he said that from all these people running over his body, that all of his clothing was torn off by men running over his body. So here's this dead person had just been like torn apart by these people stepping on him. Now, within a short time, the flames on the Sultana were out of control. The whole center of the boat started burning. This, what happened here is the flames were coming from, or the wind was coming from this way. So it was blowing all the flames towards the rear or the stern of the boat. And suddenly it dawned on these people on the bow that that was the safest place to be. The flames were going that way. And if you didn't panic, if you didn't get knocked into the water, just stay there and wait. Everything's burning that way. You might be okay. You might be able to wait for a rescue boat. Those people on the stern, however, where the flames were coming, now it was their turn to panic. And they started pushing each other off and going into the water again by the hundreds. People were jumping on top of people. People from this deck were jumping out and being hit from people from up above. They were just knocking people all over the place. There's a picture here of, actually there were 3 brothers on the Sultana. This fellow up here in the corner is a cousin. He was on the Confederate side. These 3 here were on the Union side. And the fellow in the corner here, he ended up dying on the Sultana. This fellow, Robert Hamilton, he lived, and he was quoted as saying, from all these people jumping overboard, he said they were leaping off into the water on top of each other, and hundreds were drowning together. So they were just going down by the handful. These two fellas here were brothers from Tennessee. John Keeble on this side and Pleasant Keeble on this side had been sleeping on different parts of the deck. When this panic started, people were either jumping into the water or they started trying to climb down the stairway. Pleasant Keeble got caught up in this mass. He wanted to find out where his brother was, but he was being pushed down the stairs. He couldn't stop him. He wedged himself finally against a banister, climbed up on the banister, and started climbing across the heads of people in order to get back up onto the deck. So he literally climbed across a mass of people, got on the deck, ran over to where his brother was sleeping, and found that there was nothing more than a hole there. His brother was dead. He never saw his brother again. His brother had been killed. He then decided it was time to save himself, and he did. I have a drawing here which is to represent, there was the civilian passengers on board. People forget about them. One lady that was on board, she was on board with her 7-year-old daughter and her husband. How old are you at your brothers in front here? Okay, you're 7 years old. Okay, so you're about the age of the little daughter that was on board here. When the explosion took place, she put a life belt on herself, and it wasn't like the life belts we have now. It's just sort of it just goes around your waist. She put one on, her husband put one on, they put one on the little baby, or the little girl, and they put the little girl on his back and said, "You hang on, we're jumping in." He jumped into the water, she jumped in. Her life belt was not on tight enough, and started to ride up on her, so she swam over to the rudder, held onto the rudder, and readjusted her belt. In the meantime, she was watching, and these other soldiers were still jumping in and such. They grabbed onto her husband and her little girl died. They ended up drowning right in front of her. She was just about going crazy. She was just about ready to say, you know, this is it. She let go of the rudder. She started screaming. One of the soldiers heard her, swam over and grabbed her and put her on a piece of wood and saved her life. I did not have a photograph of her in my book. My book came out, and all of a sudden, I got a lot of letters from different people saying, you know, hey, this and this. And we now have a photograph of that lady, Ann Annis was her name. We don't have a photograph of the husband or the little girl, but she did survive the Sultana. She was about 42 years old. She was a pretty old lady at that time. And this is a picture of her here. Now, eventually the stern of the boat just was totally swept. All the men were forced off. But as I said, the bow of the boat remained fairly safe. While the Sultana was burning like that, this steamboat here, the Bostona II, suddenly came downriver and it saw the Sultana burning. And the captain said, throw everything off that'll float. So they started throwing chairs. They were ripping doors off and throwing doors. They were ripping shutters off and throwing shutters, the planks that the men would use to get from the land to the boat. Throw everything off. to try and help save people. They were throwing ropes out and bringing people in. They were using rowboats to get people and bring them back. Eventually they saved between 100 and 150 people, and Captain Watson then made the decision that we got to take these people down to Memphis and report the disaster. There were a lot more people in the water, but he said we got 100 to 150 people that are so badly hurt they need medical attention, plus we have to go down and tell everybody to come and help these men. So they eventually left. He would go down to Memphis. When he got there, he found out that they already knew. People had floated all the way downriver and had told Memphis, but he didn't know this. And he then put those 100, 150 people on the shore, went back into the river and rescued another 100. So in all, he rescued about 250 people. And in 1874, Congress actually had a special grant given to him that gave him $3,962 for the amount of money for the stuff that he lost being thrown overboard to help save these people from the Sultana. So he was like the hero of the Sultana disaster. Now, once the Bostona left, what happened was the paddle wheel that was on the side suddenly burned through and fell into the river. And when it fell into the river, it didn't fall all the way off. So now it acted like one of those outrigger canoes, like a Hawaiian canoe. It's got this big thing sticking out the side. So now the river, the current hits that and suddenly pushes the boat around. So now these men that had been out in front that were safe are now being turned around because now the wind is still blowing the flames towards them. It got almost completely around when the second paddle wheel burned off, and then those two fell away. So now the Sultana was now going downriver, and the flames were being pushed towards these men on the bow who thought that they were safe. So suddenly a second panic occurred as now the flames were coming towards them, and they just started jumping into the river. And these, for the most part, were people that had stayed on the boat because they couldn't swim. And by this time also, all the little pieces of wood had been taken by people. So now these people are jumping into the river with nothing to hold on to. And again, a second mass panic and a second big drowning started off the bow. John Simpson was only 16 years old. He was from the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. He was floating in the river. He had jumped into the river. He was floating in the river. He had been hit in the head with a piece of wreckage. He had a fractured skull. And as he floated along, he was worried about one thing, and that was that alligator. He thought that the alligator was going to come up and eat him. And there was a number of soldiers that did this. But they didn't have anything to worry about because this fella here, William Luganville with the 135th Ohio, he had remembered the alligator. But more importantly, he remembered the sturdy wooden crate that alligator was in. And he broke open the closet door, and he killed the alligator, threw the alligator out on the deck, took that sturdy crate, pulled it over, threw it into the water, and jumped into it, and used the crate like a little rowboat to row himself to safety. So he survived the disaster because of his ingenuity. He remembered that sturdy wooden crate. Down at Memphis, with the Sultana having blown up here, it was slowly drifting by, but a lot of the men that had jumped down had floated even further. And the first person to float all the way downriver to Memphis down here was a man named Wesley Lee from the 102nd Ohio. And as he was floating past the city, he could see the lights. He started to yell. Men on the shore heard him, pulled him aboard and said, what'd you do? Get pulled in by the flood? And he said, no, I was on the Sultana. The Sultana blew up. Well, immediately they started ringing the bells for the steamboats. They started sending people into the river with little rowboats. The steamboats started building up steam. They had to get their engines and stuff going before they could actually go to the rescue. But in the meantime, they sent out their little boats. Two of the vessels that went out to help were military vessels. This is the ironclad Essex and the gunboat Tyler. And the Tyler had been involved in the Battle of Shiloh. It had helped General Grant at the Battle of Shiloh. They were both tied up, but they immediately started sending out their little rowboats and stuff to try and help all these different people that were floating past the city. Some of the boats from the Essex, the one on the top, actually floated far enough down past the river. They got down here by this Fort Pickering, and Fort Pickering was a fort that was supposed to guard the southern approach to Memphis. It was garrisoned by people from the 3rd United States Colored Artillery. They were stationed there. They were told, if you see any boats floating by here, they have to come to shore. If they don't come to shore, you shoot at them. So these guards saw these boats out there. They didn't know that they were rescuing people, and they told them, come into shore. When the guys didn't do it, they started shooting at them. So now you got these prisoners floating down the river, and people are shooting at them. So it just got worse for these guys on the Sultana. Eventually, the boats came. They told the guards, you know, look, we had this terrible disaster. Can't you help? They said, okay. They started building fires to warm the men. They sent out boats themselves, and they did help in the disaster to help save people. The Sultana eventually floated downriver, and it got tied up at some trees. Now again, remember, the trees are just the top, sticking above the water. That's where they tied the boat off. There was 37 men that once all of the decks burned away, all you had was just the floating, just the hull of the Sultana. 37 men climbed back up onto it, and they were waiting for a rescue when some people from this mound city here put together a little raft and went out and got the men and brought them. They'd take up the trees and bring them back and forth. When they got the last man off, it was just like in the movies. They got the last man off, and suddenly the deck of the hull of the Sultana made a shudder and then sank. So the Sultana did sink at the head of this island called Hen Island. And all, as I said, those 37 had been taken off. Down at, people were just floating through all parts of the river. By this time, steamboats had gotten enough steam, and they were coming to the rescue. People were hanging to the trees. They were hanging and floating to anything. And by this time now, the sun was starting to come up. The men that had been caught in the trees, they started looking around, and they thought it was sort of funny, because now all these people were sitting like frogs up in the trees. So they started croaking like frogs. They started crowing at the sun coming up, and they started singing old army songs. So even though they were in this terrible position, they were still trying to keep their humor up. Now the victims were brought down to Memphis, and they were put in wagons, and they were taken off to hospitals. One person that was found was that 7-foot Tennessean, the guy that had been so drunk he had been put on board with a bayonet. When they got him down to Memphis down here, he was still drunk. They tried to put him into one of these wagons and take him to the hospital, and he didn't want to go into the back of a wagon. He was fighting with the army guys. They finally said, okay, we'll march you to the hospital. They started marching him to the hospital, and as he was going up there, he was passing by a lot of shops, and he started to steal the hats and the coats and the jackets and the pants and everything, and he had a whole armful, and the people from the shops were following after him. And they were saying, you know, that's my hat, and that's my coat, and that's my pants. He got all the way to the hospital. He finally threw them up in the air, and he said, here. When they went and started picking up their hats and coats, he started kicking them in the pants and knocking them over and everything. So this guy was just, you know, unruly. I guess he hadn't had whiskey in so long, it just really affected him badly. That was just one of the humorous sides of the Sultana, but there, of course, is the side of so many dead bodies that were eventually collected and brought down to the riverfront. Originally, they were placed into coffins. Memphis ran out of coffins, and they had to start putting the bodies just along the wharf there. The survivors went down to the wharf, and they tried to look for their brothers or their fathers or friends that had been in the regiment with them. One brother, Samuel Pickens, took and went down to the river to look for his brother William. He looked and he looked and looked all day long, and eventually he had to write home and tell his mother, Brother William is among the lost. He says, I have not heard of him since the explosion took place, and I have no hope of ever hearing of him anymore. And sure enough, William did die on the Sultana. Now the Sultana, 521 people were taken to hospitals. Another 241 were taken to what was called the Soldiers' Home, and this is sort of like a USO place. So for a total of 762. However, the newspapers reported that there were 786 people rescued. So there's probably 20, 25 people that were possibly put in private homes or just didn't go into the hospitals. Of this 786, eventually 200 would die in the Memphis hospital. So there were only about 580 survivors out of over 2,500 people on board. Whole regiments, almost whole entire regiments were wiped out by the Sultana disaster. The 18th Michigan Infantry had 129 people on board and lost 71, so that was 55% of that regiment. The 9th Indiana Cavalry from Indianapolis area had 112 men on board, and they lost 59, which is a 53%. The 3rd Tennessee Cavalry had 398 men on board and lost 213 men. That was 54%. And the 102nd Ohio Infantry had 108 on board and lost 71. That was 66% of the men on board. The government said that only 1,238 people died. They tried to minimize it. Plus, they didn't know about this other 500 men. They had missed that second train. They didn't know that there was that many men on board the Sultana. The actual count is probably 1,746 to 1,796 people dead. So almost 1,800 people. Of the crew of 85, only about 26 lived. Of the 100 civilians on board, only between 23 and 25 survived. And there was only about 2 women out of like 15 or 16 women, there was only 2 that survived. The Sultana did get newspaper coverage pretty good in the Midwest area here. Chicago covered it, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, a lot of the river towns, they covered it. Of course, Knoxville, where the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry had come from, they covered it. The men were predominantly from Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana. Those states covered it pretty well. However, out in the East Coast, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, they covered it initially, but once they found out that none of their troops were on board the Sultana, they dropped it like a hot potato and they didn't cover it anymore. This woodcut here is a famous picture of the Sultana, and this ran in Harper's Weekly, which was like the big magazine at the time. The only thing is it just ran with this, and underneath it, it just said, the burning of the Sultana. It had no story about it. The story had come out the week before. So if you didn't read the story, you didn't know what this picture was all about. So it was odd. They didn't run the 2 of them together. They ran one time and one the next time. Now, the government did look into it to try and find out what had caused the disaster and who was responsible. There were 3 government inquiries into it. Of the men that you have on your picture here, Mason was killed on board the disaster. He lived through the explosion. He was seen helping people. They never saw him get off the boat, so he died. Dana, who was in charge of the central Mississippi area and Vicksburg, who could have been responsible and could have removed these men from the boat, he resigned on May 27th, 1865, a month after the disaster. Once he became a civilian, the government, or the Army could no longer go after him and court-martial him or ask him to testify. He was a civilian, and times were different back then. General Smith, who was in charge of the city of Vicksburg itself, who also had known about the overcrowding and didn't do anything about it, he resigned on July 12th. Once again, he became a civilian. He was exonerated. Hatch, down here, for all the trouble that he had caused, all the court-martial trouble he had been in and stuff like that, he was honorably discharged on July 28, 1865. On his last trip upriver to St. Louis, he was carrying some money for the government, and mysteriously, the safe got stolen, got robbed on this steamboat. And the captain stopped the boat in the middle of the river and said, "We're not going anywhere until that money returns. We're going to search everywhere and everybody's stateroom and everything until we find that money." Well, out of the blue, half of the money suddenly returned. And the captain said, "Well, okay, that's good enough, we'll go upriver." Eventually, Hatch was found liable for that money because he had been escorting it without a bonded courier. So this was the one time in his life that he got caught with something, and it did cost him some money. But he was honorably discharged, and again, he refused to come to any of the court-martial trials. He refused subpoenas and everything, and the government just couldn't do anything about it. Williams, the guy in the middle here, he was a regular Army officer. He had graduated from West Point, and there was no way that the government was going to go after him. He was a good officer, a good man, and they didn't want to go after one of their own. That left Captain Speed. Speed had been the officer that had been out at the camp. He had been the one sending the people in. He had not been at the Sultana. He did not come to the Sultana until late in the evening when it was already crowded, yet he's the one that they picked as a scapegoat. They brought him to a trial in January of 1866, and he was found guilty of overloading the Sultana. He protested and everything, but eventually the verdict was sent up to the Judge Advocate General to look at. He looked at it, and he said, "Now, you guys are crazy. He didn't do this." So he exonerated him, gave him an honorable discharge, and Speed was done. However, they never went any further, so nobody was ever found guilty or held accountable for the Sultana disaster. The cause of the disaster, however, was determined that it was the faulty boilers, and wasn't the men. The men on board they did not overweigh it because their total weight would not have equaled the amount of cotton that the Sultana could have taken. They were overcrowded, they were too crowded, but they were not overly heavy. So it wasn't the men that had caused it was the bad boilers, perhaps low water in there, too much steam, and just the bad shape of the boilers. And again, that would have made Mason accountable, but Mason had been killed, so it was an easy scapegoat for them to blame something like this on. The survivors of the Sultana, they got together year after year, and they would meet, and in 1912, they met, and in April 27th of 1912, one of the things they were talking about was the loss of the Titanic, which had happened on April 14th, April 15th. And there was a lot of similarities between the two. The Titanic had held 2,223 people. The Sultana had held 2,250 to 2,300. The numbers are real similar. The Titanic, the survivors had been 705 people lived on the Titanic. Pulled from the waters of in the Sultana was 786. So again, they're roughly about the same. The amount of people that died on the Titanic was 68%. The Sultana had 65%. So it sounded about the same. However, the Sultana had lost another 200 people that had died in the hospitals. So they actually lost 75% of their people. It was a much higher death rate than had been on the Titanic. So the Sultana does outweigh the Titanic as far as casualties. And look at the size of these two. This is a drawing comparing the two sides. You can see if you have 2,500 people crowded on this boat, and you have 2,200 on this, these are going to have a lot more room than these guys on this. So that's just a comparison that I've drawn up just to show you how jam-packed those men really were on board that boat. The last thing I'll say, and then if anybody's got any questions, is Major Will McTeer of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, who had lost, as I said, they lost over 200 men on board the Sultana. He wrote a fitting little description, and he wrote here, he said, now, and this is a quote, and I'll finish with this. It says, he wrote, "Many were killed while others were drowned. There in the bosom of the Mississippi they found their last resting place. No stone or monument marks the spot where their ashes lie. There is no tablet marked with their name or even unknown for them. There is not even a hillock to which friends and survivors can go and drop a tear of remembrance of these noble defenders of the Union. Flowers are strewn over the graves in the cemeteries of our dead, but there are no flowers for the dead of the people who went down in the Sultana. But let us remember them." So that's all I have to say on the Sultana. One question some people might have is, have they found it? Yes, the Sultana has been found. It lies in the bottom of a bean field in just opposite Memphis. It's an Arkansas side. What has happened is the river, where it sank, the river built it over with silt and dirt and then changed courses. So it's now about 10 to 15 feet underground in an Arkansas bean field. I have in the back there some pieces of brick and some pieces of boiler plating that I brought home from the wreck. It's been found. There's probably not much there. Most everything has been burnt on it. What could be salvaged was divers went down to the wreck to look at it to see what the cause was. This is in 1865. People dove down. They also salvaged what they could. Any machinery, any engines and stuff that they thought could be used, they took off of it, and and if they could, they used it. If not, they just threw it on the top of this island. Eventually, over the years, that's where this stuff has come. It's on this island, so it's higher than where the Sultana is. The Sultana is still buried. So as farmers plow their fields, every now and then they'll dig up a piece of this metal, and they take it and they throw it over by the tree line, and that's where it sits along the tree line. So if you're looking for artifacts from the Sultana, you don't look where the Sultana is, you look along this tree line, and you can find little stoves and big pieces of metal that have been twisted and burnt and such like that, and that's where I found the bricks and the boiler plate. Does anybody have any questions on anything that I might have missed, or that you got a point that you specifically want me to touch on? Or if not, that concludes my talk. I've got the stuff in the background, and that's it, I guess. Go ahead.
How come you chose this subject?
How come I chose it? I used to live about 100 miles outside of Chicago, and I would go to the little, it's a town of about 7,000 people, and I would go to the library and read all the books on the Civil War. I was always interested in the Civil War, and I read a book called Transport to Disaster, written in 1962 by a fellow whose grandfather was on board. That's how he knew about it, because his grandfather, he had heard stories. So he did this book. And he used a lot of the Memphis newspapers and then his grandfather's telling and a couple of the other survivors' accounts. But he had no bibliography and no footnotes and nothing that when I read it, I was fascinated by it. But I wanted to find out more. But because he had no footnotes and no bibliography, I didn't know where to start. So I wrote down or called down to Memphis and got a hold of their newspapers, and just from there, and this was 18 years ago, I just started, growing with it. And I was fascinated. And the thing that captured my attention was that nobody knew how many men were on board. There had never been a complete listing of the soldiers. And I thought to myself, that's a challenge, maybe that's what I could do. And so I took and I started on a computer compiling a list of these men. And in my book, I have a list of the soldiers by state, by regiment, and I have whether they survived or they died, and if they survived, what hospital they were taken to, and what injury they had, if it's known, if they had like a broken arm or a head contusion or scalded, heavily scalded or something like that. And over the years, I got in contact with more and more of the relatives. There's a reunion that we have every year in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the only monument, the government never built a monument to these men. The only monument that's out there is in Knoxville, Tennessee. The 3rd Tennessee Cavalry went and bought their own monument. And it's dedicated to all Tennesseans, not just the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. It's dedicated to all the people in Sultana, but on it are marked the names of all the Tennessee soldiers. And this is just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. So we go down to that. There's a reunion held with relatives, and believe it or not, there's 3 people whose fathers were on board the Sultana. They're still alive. They remember their father talking about it, going to reunions and such like that. They're now in their 80s and such, but they can still remember all that. And by meeting these people, I got more and more stories in the photographs and such that I have in the back. And I would write articles for the newsletter and for magazines and stuff, and they started telling me, you gotta write a book, you gotta write a book. So that's what I did. I wrote the book.
So we have the book.
So you guys have the book, right? I've got it for sale, but if you want to save, it costs $30, and that's the price that actually. That's $3 less than they charge in the store, minus taxes. It would be like $35 in the store. But if you want to save $30, come to the library and take the book out. So you can do that. But that's how I got interested in the Sultana. It's just a fascinating story, and it needs to be told. That's why I wrote the book. I want everybody to really know about it. It's just, it's been lost because it happened at the time when Lincoln was assassinated, and they were looking for John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's body was being brought across the United States to be buried in Springfield, and this was all taken to the newspaper, the article, the headlines. When the Sultana happened, as I said, in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, the big newspapers, they found out that there were no New York or Pennsylvania troops or Massachusetts troops, and they just sort of, what do we care about these guys from the Midwest? So it was quickly dropped. Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned finding that photograph after you start looking at it. Are you getting all sorts of new information?
I'm getting all sorts of, not so much new information that's anything different than what I have, but I'm getting more accounts from other people. I've gotten probably about 10 new photographs of soldiers, and what I tell people is, keep sending me this, because I have a file, a big file cabinet, a couple of drawers, filled with all these, different people that I have, all alphabetical and then broken down into regiments and such. And if somebody, a relative, writes to me or something, I'll see if I have any information on their relative. If I don't, then I try to see what company he was with, and then I can send out accounts from that person's company and say they probably all stayed together in a group, And even though I can't be 100% certain, if Company C of the 18th Michigan was on the bow, and your relative was in Company C, 18th, the chances are he was with this group. And this is what happened to these 3 guys, so this may be similar to what happened to your relative. And I tried doing that. And also I'm thinking, when I wrote my manuscript, it was originally 750 pages. They had me cut it down to 450. So 400 pages. So I have 350 pages that didn't make this book. And eventually, I'd like to take and write a book, maybe 10 years down the road, and rather than have a real nice story, just put in the accounts, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, just put them in alphabetical order with these photographs and stuff that I didn't get into the book. So nothing will go to waste. Hopefully, it'll eventually get into print, the stuff that I had to cut out. That was either just too small or just, you know, repetition of what I already had in there. So, any other questions? If not, I'm glad you could all show up, and I hope you all enjoyed it and learned something. And go back and tell people about the Sultana, and they'll say, what? I guarantee it, they'll say, what?